I started playing Shadow War recently, and for the most part, I have been enjoying it. Once they let me kind of like loose on the open world, I have been just hunting like orcs down left and right. The combat's alright for the most part. Like it's not too challenging, but it's definitely fun to play around with. The highlight, of course, is the Nemesis system that everyone talks about, which was so graciously locked behind a patent by our loving company, Warner Bros. The system is definitely very impressive. To have NPCs, enemies, adapt to the players is extremely impressive for the genre. And that's why we're so lucky we're never gonna get to experience it again, at least not probably anytime soon. Especially since the studio that does it got shut down. I love it here. But the reason I specifically said it's impressive for the genre is because it really is impressive for a video game. Because generally, NPCs in video games are very limited in how much the player can actually affect or change them. Yeah, you might have like branching storylines, things of that nature, but it never really feels like characters are actively changing based on like the micro decisions that a player might be making. Which of course, because of how I am and how I see the world, got me to think about how I can kind of incorporate the things that I do actually like about the system into a D&D setting. I've definitely seen some discussions online, and especially some videos about making like a Nemesis system for D&D. My only caveat with that is that I actually don't really think that the Nemesis system is impressive outside the realm of a video game, especially for like a tabletop game. It's not that impressive. Like in a tabletop setting, you aren't bounded by like a set of code or like limitation on space or just, time and things like that. The only limits to an NPC and where they grow is up to the DM and like your actual imagination. That's the only limit. So having like an adaptive system isn't like the most possible like impressive thing. It's impressive because it's a video game, but if you put it into a tabletop setting, it's not necessarily the biggest change in the world. But there's definitely like little bits of the actual system that I enjoy that I want to kind of like take in bits and pieces and bobs to put into my own games, just to make them a little bit more interesting and have my players think a little bit more about the like individual actions that they take, especially during combat with my enemies. I've also seen kind of discussion on like rivals and rival parties, and I've liked those videos and I've tried to incorporate them in my own game already. But just having like a team of enemies that aren't necessarily like villainous, they are just antagonists in some way. And I think that would be a fun thing to kind of put together. I mentioned in a previous video that I'm working on a new campaign because my current campaign is probably ending in a year or two, which seems like a really long time, but it means that I need to patch out every possible problem that I have with my current game. And also kind of introduce new rules that would make more sense with the new campaign setting. With my new campaign, it's kind of like a warlike setting. It's a lot bigger scale. It's a cataclysm. They're dealing with like more minions, which is why I kind of thought of incorporating things like the Nemesis system to begin with. And also, I kind of still really wanted to have a enemy party that kind of is an elite party in the same way that my players are. So I kind of want to take the idea of the Nemesis system and then like the rival parties system that a lot of people play with and kind of put them together to make something I'm very vaguely calling the Nemesis Party. Essentially, the idea is having a party that mirrors my players, but also kind of adapts to them mechanically throughout the game. So let's take what I can from both of these systems and then start talking about what I actually like about them and then put that together. What I'm ultimately trying to achieve with this system is to have my players feel like all of their actions kind of matter on a grand scale. They're going to see a lot more of their individual actions kind of mattering, especially if they can see it reflected in a party that kind of reflects them in some way. D&D, as I see it, is a game of cause and effect. The players are the cause, the world is, the world is the effect. And I really want to make sure that that cause feels a little bit more impactful, especially with a story this grand. Before I get into this though, I do want to clarify that I'm not exactly taking the Nemesis system. There's some things that I won't be using, and there's some things from like rival parties that I won't necessarily be using for this, just for the purposes of my game. Of course, whatever your story is, what story you're trying to tell, you need to adjust it to fit your campaign. First things first, I am not going to be having like a large amount of NPCs or enemies that kind of like slowly rise up in ranks. My players don't really care about hierarchies, and I don't really care to do things that they don't necessarily care about unless I find it really interesting. So I won't be doing that. My players are not great at bookkeeping a lot of NPC names, so I'm not gonna be doing that, especially if it's like a bunch of, randomly generated orcs. In this setting, they're not gonna be orcs, but you get the point. They're not really gonna care about that. The second thing is I'm not going to have a large focus in this game revolving around death. In Shadow of War, A big part of the game is the fact that you can revive and these orcs can get revived, but I already made a video about how I feel about revival. So a lot of the system, I'm going to be kind of adapting to a deathless system. Death is not going to be a large component of my Nemesis system. They don't grow by killing you, they just grow by fighting you, or like learning from you. And then in terms of like, you know, teams, I am more thinking of them as like enemy teams, not rivals. I still do want them to reflect them, kind of like in Pointy Hat's video where he's talking about rival teams. I'd need them to be kind of like almost foils to my characters, but they are a little bit more based off like the elite teams, as Mystic DM kind of points out. Okay, so that's the main gist of the stuff that I'm going to be cutting out from those systems that don't really work for my campaign. If they work for yours, you can figure out a way to implement them on your end. But this is kind of just for me, really. First things first, I want to have a focus on mirroring roles. Usually when you have some kind of rival party, you want to mirror the party in some way, usually in the roles that they play within their actual team. That can come in the form of like having like a wizard and then enemy team has a wizard. Which makes sense on paper, but I think it's a little bit boring and a little bit reductive. So what I think I would prefer to do is have a focus on the actual like combat and then like team, like group dynamic role. My next campaign is going to be a seafaring campaign as well, which means that we're going to be on boats, and I have a whole boat rule set that I'm working on that will be out eventually, and I will put that up for free, and I will have like a whole sheet for it. But let's say we have like a rogue and their role on the ship is the gunner. The enemies can have a mirrored gunner as well, but they don't necessarily have to be a rogue. They could just be like a ranger or something. So, you know, they share a similar role in the like parties, you know, like rogues and rangers are pretty similar, I think, in terms of like style. And then also like role of the actual like ship or their group dynamic, they're the gunner. So it doesn't have to be exact, but you know, similar. For example, like an enemy spellcaster doesn't necessarily have to be a wizard, it could be a sorcerer, it could be a warlock, you know, that kind of thing on the side. Just figure out what you think a good kind of similar class to them would be without necessarily having to be the same thing. It could be a different subclass as well. I think it's more fun if you make them a little different. And because I really want to kind of hammer in this kind of like Nemesis thing and maybe get the rival thing a little bit more, I want each of the like Nemesis like enemies to be a result of player actions within my first few sessions. As the campaign is starting and the first few sessions play out, I want each of the players to have a moment with an enemy NPC where they are kind of locked in combat somehow, or they scorn them in some way, and this NPC then forms a grudge against the player, becoming their nemesis, and kind of getting stronger as a result of that. The idea is that each of these very hatred-fueled little, you know, nemesis people get together, find out they have the same disdain for the same group, and then kind of form their own group that mirrors, you know, our player characters. I personally think this is just going to be like a little fun thing for my players, because part of their own actions in the first few set of, you know, sessions that we're going to be having is going to create their own villains. Because as a player, having some of that player choice is fun, because for the most part, a lot of campaigns, players already have their villains set out for them. You know, you're playing a Curse of Strahd game, you know who the big bad is Strahd. Or if you're playing in my campaign, I have a big bad in mind, but for them to be able to set up their own kind of like side villains as well, that must feel like you have a little bit more power and feel maybe a little bit more investment in the story that way. And then this rival party, once they kind of get set up, they are going to be challenging the players in ways that aren't necessarily combat as well. So in this campaign, I'm going to be having my players kind of go around and capture objectives. So these enemies are also going to go around capturing objectives. If they're not capturing objectives, they are slowing down our players in some way in capturing their own objectives, or they're just kind of be a thorn in their side. It doesn't always have to be combat. They should be in the world, kind of influencing things outside of a fight. But of course, my players occasionally do crave a bit of that combat, want to use their cool spells and their cool abilities and all the cool items that I'm going to give them, so we will have them fight at some point. So how that will actually work is going to be listed out here. My favorite part of the Nemesis system is not necessarily that the enemies get stronger each time they kill me, or like after a campaign ends and they get a level up. I don't really care about that all that much. My favorite part of the whole system is the fact that they adapt live during a fight, or like immediately after a fight. So for example, I, in Shadow of War, love to just vault over all the enemies. Almost every single captain I fought ended up getting the Vault Breaker ability, like mid-fight or after encountering me. Same thing with like fire. I set them on fire, so some of them became fireproof at some point. I think that is really fascinating. That's a fun way to show growth in like an NPC or a character, is by having them adapt to the player's actions. It's much more interesting than just having, their stats go up, they get a +1 in here. That's not like super interesting, or like it's not very interactive. How I'm actually going to be playing this off is that my enemies are going to be smart enough not to fight a losing battle. They will go in, they are very, they have grudges against all of our players, but they're not going to go in and let themselves die if it means that they don't get to complete their mission, which is killing my players. So what they're actually going to be doing is, if they're losing, they're going to back off. They're going to take the information and they are going to come back more prepared. This allows my enemies to kind of grow without necessarily having to just up their numbers, right? It's having them grow in a little bit more of an interesting way. Their battle tactics, how I move them on the field, will be a little bit different, because me as the DM has learned how these player characters have decided to move on a battlefield, and what spells they like. How this will work mechanically is to have the enemies actually gain abilities that counter whatever your players are doing. As a DM, I'm very hyper aware of like what abilities my players use at all times. A lot of them love to use certain spells, and they kind of stick to it because that's what they know. One of my players, she uses Shatter all the time. That's her favorite like attack spell. The other player likes to use Vortex Warp and Eldritch Blast a whole lot. I had a player who just like spammed magic missiles, another player who loves fireballing everything, So my enemies could perhaps, let's say there's a bunch of fireballs going out, they gain either like a fire resistance or a resistance to the spell itself, to fireball. Like they've learned to counter the fireball in some way. They maybe don't take as much damage, or they learn a special use of just like a one-time use counterspell that can counterspell only that spell, right? That way you're not punishing the players by giving them like a counterspell that can counterspell everything, but they learn specifically to mess with your fireball because they don't want you to use it as much. Or perhaps one of the enemies learned to stop a second wind if it's casted or if it's used by a fighter right in their face. If a martial character is using a lot of slashing weapons, perhaps the enemies come back with slashing resistant gear. This all comes together to kind of create a system in which my players will have to be a little bit more careful about the individual choices that they have, and also make sure that while they are leveling up and gathering abilities, that they are a little bit more in tune with gathering like a variety of options. For example, let's say like a fighter or something, you should have like a secondary weapon in your bag, just in case they have come to counter your specific damage type. Maybe they came with that resistant gear, you have bludgeoning weapons instead. If you're like a spellcaster and they have learned to counter one of your favorite spells, this forces you to be a little bit more diverse with the spells that you choose and to keep in your spellbook, or even like pick up scrolls just in case you need to use it so that you can get past their resistance. Now you have a party that's kind of on your tail, who is constantly kind of getting in the way of your objectives going by, and they're smart enough to like run away if they're losing, and they will take the knowledge of whatever you used against them against your players. They will also kind of put a fire under your players' feet because they know that there's an opposing team out there trying to get to the objectives too, and if they wait around too long or have too long of like downtime, this enemy team could have essentially kind of take out outposts that the players maybe wanted to take over, that kind of thing. So you have this team that, one, challenges your players by making them make interesting choices, but also kind of puts the fire under their feet to move the story along. And that's kind of the ultimate goal that I wanted with this. But I'm personally really excited to actually try this in my own games. I've kind of run it by a few of them. They seem interested with it. And I'm excited to try it. If you end up trying doing something similar with enemies mechanically grow against the players, not just in stats, like in actual like abilities made to counter certain things that the players do, then let me know how that goes. Comment down below if you have anything interesting to add to this, or ways that you can actually improve my little thoughts here. Of course, this is just my word vomit, but if you've made it this far, I would love to hear if you have any ideas of how kind of to improve this a little bit, because I really do want to make a system that's adaptive to players, that's not just their HP goes up by 10, because that's boring. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening to my word vomit once again. You have a great and wonderful day.